Now, of course, ahead of tomorrow's local government election, what can we look forward to? What is voter turnout possibly expected to look like? Let's speak now to political analyst Dr. Joleen Steyn Kotze, who joins me now live. Thank you very much, Dr. Joleen Steyn Kotze. I want to look at voter turnout. That is one of the critical aspects, Doc, of possibly what would determine the outcome of this election. We've seen in the past a decline in the number of people who are casting their ballots. What are we likely to see this time around? If we look at, for example, the number of people who have applied and gone for the special vote are at about 1.1 million. Where do we decide in terms of voter turnout what it's likely to look like?
You know, I think it's a very interesting and I think almost critical question, because what we are sitting with now is a situation where we almost have to kind of try and predict, will people be going to the polls? And we have seen, I would argue, since the 1999 election, quite a decline in voter turnout. And of course, that decline culminated quite significantly in the 2019 general elections, where approximately just under half of the population opted out of the electoral process. So, you know, when we start looking at the local government context, of course, we also know that within that particular context, voter turnout can be quite lower than expected when we start looking at a national government election context. So my thinking is, you know, we have to bear in mind that we cannot predict how many people are actually going to go out to the polls. And we've heard various analysis and speculations around low voter turnout maybe harming the African National Congress because they will be unable to get their supporters to the polls. Yeah. We may also see a scenario with all the new emerging political parties where people might be saying, oh, I'm going to try one of the smaller parties and see what happens.
Doc, I mean, this is the last local government election before we hit the 30-year mark of democracy. How significant is this, in particular, given the strides that have been made since the dawn of democracy and what the electorate is still complaining about so many years later?
You know, for me, your local government elections really start telling a story around, you know, what are possible trends that are emerging in terms of voter behavior, in terms of voter perception, political participation. Are people actually going out to the polls to vote? You know, and I think what we've seen very much over the last, almost at that 30-year mark, and noting that we do have a very, very youthful population, there is a lot of concern around the lack of participation of youth. And I find that question quite interesting because we have to bear in mind we come from a rich liberation struggle history. We come from an inheritance almost of participating, of being politically engaged. And I think to a large degree, we do see political engagement within youth politics. But what I do think is we see a disillusionment with these formal processes like voting or participating in ward committees, and rather operating outside those platforms through protest action, through social media mobilization. So I'm starting to think, you know, that if we start casting our eye from what lessons that we can possibly learn depending on what happens in this local government election, we do need to start asking the question, what is the political legacy that we will start looking at once we hit that important 3 decades of democracy mark in 2024?
Youth politics also been an important aspect as well. Looking at youth politics and, how the youth, most political parties certainly wanting to clinch, the vote of young people in this country. I mean, what is to be our democratic legacy in terms of youth politics? Because certainly the voice that seems to be louder at the moment is that we have an apathetic youth.
No, I think, I often wonder whether we are not being unfair towards the youth. Because we do speak of, the youth are politically apathetic, they are just not interested. But we also have to bear in mind that, over the last few years, the youth has faced quite a lot of significant challenges, economic challenges, social challenges. There's been various crises around job creation, economic growth, development. And within that, there are also high levels of dissatisfaction with democracy, because there is this instrumentalist support to say, well, I don't see a direct connection between my vote and my life necessarily getting better. So I don't necessarily think that the youth are politically apathetic or disengaged. What I do think, however, is that there is almost this disillusionment with these formal processes around, a democracy, around creating that better life, and around some very significant challenges the youth will face in future. I mean, we have to consider bigger questions that future generations in 20 or 30 years are going to face, and that could also include questions around climate change, for example. And political parties are not really having those critical conversations with the youth.
All right, and in terms of tomorrow, if we look at the special votes that have been cast, this is unprecedented. We're hearing from the IEC, 1.1 million people who, of course, applied for special votes. And does this give us any indication? What can we tell from the populace currently, Doc, about, their willingness to go out and participate in South Africa's election tomorrow? Of course, we'll be able to tell that once the numbers start coming in, how many people have actually participated. But do we have any indication as of just these few hours before the election, judging by what we've seen over the past couple of weeks?
Again, it's very difficult to kind of predict whether people will be going out to vote or not. So I think the best predictions that one could almost make is to look at past trends, because that's kind of where we learn our lessons. So from the past, most notably the previous election had the lowest number of voter turnout in South Africa's democratic history. So we could possibly find even lower numbers going out to the polls. And I do think also a critical element of that, as I've noted, South Africa generally has a very youthful population, and it seems the youth are not also really engaging in these formal processes. So, I note political parties are trying to convince their voters to go out. The DA has ran a campaign to say they need those majorities, and for me, that also raises some questions around, in the minds of the voter, are the political parties reflecting very critically on their failures within the coalition government? And are they having those conversations with the voters that voters might want to hear, to say, listen, in the event that we do not get a majority, this is who we're going to work with. These are our developmental agendas. And there will be local buy-in from our local political representatives to our agreement. So, I think the politics of antagonism continues, as opposed to the politics of collaboration.
Analyst Dr. Joleen Steyn Kotze, we do appreciate your time here on the program.